All right, welcome everyone. Remembered that I made this video exactly a year ago on February 13th, 2021, where I made some predictions about how the pandemic was going to pan out. And I thought it'd be fun to revisit it a year later and see how the predictions turned out. So yeah, let's listen in here. So this is going to be a slightly different video than the usual kind that are on this channel, um, which, I just try to go over objective scientific evidence and give a little commentary, but try not to speculate too much. This video will be complete speculation, complete opinion, complete speculation, with no real basis in any real data. Okay, so at least I'm admitting it, right? Other than kind of an educated guess. Because one of the most common questions I get asked by my friends and other people is, when is this pandemic going to end, or how's it going to end? And I have an opinion on that now. At first, when this thing started, I kind of thought that we would get a vaccine out fairly quickly, and once everyone got vaccinated, it would end. That seems like that is unlikely to be the case at this point. And the other way it could have ended is if we were able to stop transmission before it became too widespread, as in the case of SARS-1 and MERS. If we could keep numbers, down in the hundreds, we could have basically eliminated the virus from the world, um, as a practical manner, and essentially eliminated thing. But we passed that threshold, over a year ago, back in January of 2020, when it became widespread. And now the thing is, it's global. Billions of people have it, and we're not likely to eliminate the virus. The Our only hope of eliminating the virus, or so I think that part is extremely clear now. We're definitely not getting rid of it. It's even more widespread now. So I think that part of the prediction is fairly accurate at this point. Getting massive control over it would have been if the virus stayed genetically relatively stable, and we were able to vaccinate a large majority of the world population and achieve, quote, herd immunity from it. That seems unlikely to happen, as new variants come out that are clinically relevant, and especially the the B1 351 from South Africa, and the Brazilian one, and possibly a new one from California. These all have mutations. So those were the viruses, the variants that I thought were the most relevant at the time. The Brazilian variant and the South African variant had a lot of immune escape. And as it turns out, the one that became the dominant strain relatively soon after this, was the Delta variant, which didn't have that much immune escape, but just had a lot of high viral load and made it a very successful and highly transmissible virus. And then we had Omicron recently. But I think the pattern of new variants that make the vaccines not able to give us herd immunity holds true. That seem to make them less, uh, make the vaccines less effective at controlling them. And I suspect this is just the start. I suspect that as vaccine rollout occurs, and the we apply selection pressure to the virus, and the virus is all over the world. There's a lot of genetic diversity to be exploited and to be used, as billions of people are infected. I think that we'll see variants that are even better at escaping the current course of vaccine. So that turns out to be, unfortunately, very true. We've recently gone through Omicron, and has very good immune escape, both from natural immunity and from vaccine immunity. And this is not like the flu, where in the flu there are specific changes in the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase surface protein of the flu, and they can try to predict which flu will be the dominant flu in the next flu season, and kind of preemptively make a vaccine for the next season. And sometimes they guess correctly and it's very good, and sometimes they guess incorrectly and the flu vaccine is not very good for that season. This is not like a recombination of, the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase of the flu. This is just random mutations in the spike protein and other proteins in the virus. These are not predictable, and we can't guess what the next variant's going to be and preemptively make a vaccine. And then once you make it, a global rollout of the next vaccine, likely the virus will mutate again and escape whatever new vaccine we make. So yeah, that turns out to be unfortunately true. Like we have no idea what the next variant's going to be, and if you can't predict the next variant, you can't make a preemptive vaccine for it. I mean, Pfizer and Moderna are making Omicron variants, but Omicron is like kind of over at this point. They're making a booster for that. So I mean, until you can predict it, the vaccines are always kind of playing catch up. We'll just constantly be in this thing where we're chasing our tail. So I suspect this is not going to end in that way. I'm going to mainly make this video just so I can come back in a year and see how wrong I was. Well, here we are. We're in a year and we're going to see how wrong we were. But I think that what's going to happen is that eventually the people that are most susceptible to the virus, unfortunately, will succumb to it. And then the people that are left will be the people that are either healthy enough to survive the virus, or their genetic makeup is such that their immune system does not overreact to the virus. Because there are some young, healthy people that succumb to the virus, and it is likely because something about their immune system makes them react, kind of overreact to the virus. And those people, if they're exposed to the virus, are unfortunately not going to do well. And so over time, there will be less and less susceptible victims to the virus. And over time, because the population of the host, which is us, the population of humans that are susceptible to severe disease will decrease. It'll become less of a problem clinically. I think that's also holding true now too, is that, and not exactly for the reasons that I thought a year ago. I mean, I thought a year ago it would just take out all the most susceptible people. I think it in many ways has done that. But the other thing that it's done is that people have gotten the previous variants, or they've been vaccinated, or both. And so everyone's immune system has a better look at the previous virus. And so now when they see future variants, the immune system is better at dealing with it, mostly through vaccination and somewhat through natural immunity as well. But I think that people that have had vaccines outnumber the people that have had natural immunity. But both of those things are helping drive better responses to future variants. So I think our response is less severe disease. And that's probably one of the reasons that Omicron was less severe disease, is because by the time Omicron came around, the most susceptible people had already succumbed, and most of the people that were left had either been vaccinated or had previously been infected, so they had some kind of some level of immunity against it. And so it may not be that Omicron was intrinsically less severe, but just that the combination of those three factors made Omicron less of a clinical problem. And eventually we'll just get used to it, and we'll tolerate it like any other endemic virus that we have. Luckily for us, from a purely objective standpoint, COVID is not extremely fatal with a fatality rate of less than 1%. If this thing was a fatality rate of 5-10%, we would be in major trouble right now. I mean, large portions of the world population would succumb. Yeah, so I think that the public health officials and policymakers are a little bit slow to come to that, and I'm hoping that they come to that fairly soon, that they realize that COVID is not as serious a disease as it was 2 years ago when we were first dealing with it. Back then, there was many unknowns and a lot of fear, and they appropriately reacted, I believe. And just as an example, at my hospital, when this COVID was starting, there were reports of when people were doing airway surgery, so surgery in the nose and in the throat and in the lungs, there was a lot of viral aerosolization and people were getting COVID. And to mitigate the chances of a false negative test for patients that were undergoing surgery for airway stuff, that we decided that we would have two tests. So I'm actually the one that pushed for that at our hospitals, for us to have two tests instead of one test to reduce the damage of false negatives, because if you have two tests, the false negative rate is even lower. And that was a good idea back then. But now now 2 years into the pandemic, the surgeons are no longer fearful, and the anesthesiologists and the ICU doctors and the pulmonologists and the nurses, they're just less fear. We're not as concerned, and the two tests is just a big burden on our patients. So we're trying to move to one test, but it's been very hard to get administration to change back to one test. And that's how I think it is at both the national and the state and even the regional levels, is that once some of these protocols are in place, it's very hard to change course, even as the data changes. I think it will happen eventually. It's just a little slower to respond to that. So I think people will eventually come to the realization that this is now a more well understood disease. We know how better to treat it. The fatality rate is much lower. And we've had vaccinations and previous natural immunity that make the disease less severe. And we probably don't need to be as aggressive about it anymore. And it would be even more of a disaster, 100-fold more of a disaster than it is already. But so I think it is eventually going to get better, but it'll get better mostly by the susceptibility of the human population becoming less through attrition. So I think that part is kind of wrong. I don't think that it's mostly through attrition that the susceptibility of the human population is getting worse. I mean, better. Um, it's partially through attrition, it's partially through vaccination, and it's partially through natural immunity. So the combination of those three things are making it so that the human population that remains on the planet now is less susceptible to this virus than it was a year ago, and especially 2 years ago. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that's how it's going to be. There's a recent paper out of Nature, it was published a few days ago, talking about how they noticed that there was one patient that they followed the genomic sequences of all the bacteria that were being produced within this patient during a prolonged infection. And when they treated this patient with convalescent plasma, the virus was very responsive to it and underwent dynamic population shifts in the genomics of the virus within even one patient. Yeah, so this is actually the probably the most widely accepted theory of how variants occur. People believe that there is genetic drift and evolution within immunocompromised patients where they have a prolonged infection and lots of viral replication within one patient. And this is one of the more commonly accepted theories on how variants occur. We don't know how exactly variants occurs. There's several theories, and I have a video on that if you guys are wanting to look at that. You can search for it. But this is one of the more commonly accepted mechanisms. But this is happening on a global scale. And so what we've determined is that this virus does respond to selection pressure and does undergo mutation to try to avoid immunogenic control. So I think I'm right, but that's what I think. The virus mutates way too quickly for us to get ahead of it on a global scale. Just the logistics of deploying vaccines globally just can't happen fast enough for a virus that mutates this quickly. But I think we're going to live with it. It's going to become an endemic virus globally, and eventually, as the severity of the disease falls off through attrition of susceptible hosts, it'll become less of a problem. Okay, so unfortunately, I think I was mostly right, and it is endemic. and we're not getting rid of it. But luckily, it is becoming less severe as the human population becomes less susceptible to it. And I don't think that, for the most part, basically, my thoughts on this haven't changed in the past year. And new data, it seems to support what I thought a year ago. And I think that we are going to have an endemic coronavirus that's with us. And, the way I think we should deal with it, and this is up to the public health officials and not me, but we probably should, there's probably going to be like annual boosters for the most susceptible population. And I think the rest of the population, they just should leave alone. And sort of treat it like we do the seasonal flu. At the very beginning of this pandemic, there were a bunch of people saying, "Oh, it's nothing but the flu, and why are we making such a big deal of it?" That was patently untrue. At the beginning of the pandemic 2 years ago, the fatality rate of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID was almost 100 times more than the seasonal flu. And then it rapidly dropped to about 10 times more fatal than the seasonal flu. So that's still, 1,000% more fatal. And that was through better treatment modalities. We learned that dexamethasone was important, and other treatment modalities. And now, as treatments have gotten even better and we have vaccinations with Omicron, the fatality rate of Omicron was very close to this fatality rate of the seasonal flu. So I think it's a very kind of a very similar clinical situation at this point. And at some point, hopefully, the policy catches up with the data on that. All right, so that was kind of fun for me to go back and see what we were thinking a year ago, and hopefully that was interesting to you guys. Thanks for watching.